Well, then we will move on to Saul Arbess. Arbess?
That's me.
That's you. Climate change and peace building.
Kind of follows a bit on the last extraordinary talk, and I'm very grateful for that presentation, as we all were. I want to talk about what I feel is a missing variable when we talk about climate change. We've had some very powerful presentations here dealing with technological change, value change. We've heard from Guy Dauncey, we've heard from a number of other people over this time. And I think there's what I want to get at here is, I think there's kind of an essential triangle. Maybe it should be four. In four, here in one of those earlier talks today. Let me try this out. We are talking about ecological adaptation, and of course I'm including in that technological change. We are talking about, well, we haven't actually talked about it much, but we do recognize the need for social justice and sharing. We recognize that without a more equitable distribution of the world's resources, that climate change will not probably be effectively realized, mitigating climate change. I call that socioeconomic justice. But we aren't talking much about peacebuilding strategies, of which many methodologies presently exist, many of them generated out of civil society, and occasionally, but not often enough, utilized by government. We tend to think of peace as a dependent variable, as an outcome of other forms of activity, rather than as a dynamic variable that conditions that outcome. So I put peace building right within that whole triangle of change. And I would go as far as to say that part of this evolution that we're talking about is an evolution which calls us to rise to our maturity as a species. The issues that presently exist are, from an anthropological point of view, which I am, are species-specific problems. It's a good way to look at them, because then when we look at things without boundaries, some say we are still in our infancy, others say we're in our adolescence, but no one says that we're a mature species. And this is what we are called now to achieve, and what is perhaps the greatest transition we ever experienced. We know that essentially our species has evolved through crisis. The agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, and now whatever we'll call the new revolution, the green revolution, or whatever we'll call it, sustainability revolution, is the next step to becoming fully human. But not only fully human, but in finding our place at last in nature as simply another species, or as Aboriginal people often refer to, we're one nation among many other nations, which are animal nations, for example. We need to look at the fact that climate wars are already upon us. Various kinds of scarcities, especially water scarcity, where competition over the use of land and resources, food scarcity, environmental migrants, and the increasing disparities of wealth, both within and between countries. We need mechanisms for dealing with these issues. And again, as I say, happily, the structures and practices of peace building are well understood. We have remarkable work that has been done by people like Johan Galtung of the group called Transcend, who's considered really, if you like, the founder of peace studies. We have other interesting bodies, actually stimulated by the previous Secretary General, the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, GPAC. And of course, one of my colleagues and friends will speak later about the work of Marshall Rosenberg in nonviolent communication. And there are many other methodologies that we could talk about in this regard. So, we are faced with this extraordinary challenge. We have the ability to transcend and to accomplish. We are at that kind of a tipping point, and we need to move to our maturity. Of course, perhaps the greatest obstacle that stands in our way is militarism. We know that it is the greatest, it is the most destructive force on earth. It uses and consumes resources to non-productive ends. And to give you one stark example, and I hope I'm correct in this, and our friend who spoke recently, the last speaker might be able to corroborate this. And when we talk about reducing, for example, greenhouse gas emissions, we start with the Pentagon as the largest institutional user of petroleum products in the world, with only 35 countries consuming more oil on a daily basis. The Pentagon is exempt from U.S. federal agencies' reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2020, which is in Obama's plan. Yet it is estimated that the military accounts for up to 80% of the federal government's energy demands. Again, the impact of the world's militaries did not receive any consideration at the UN 2009 Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen. I don't know the actual, I should as a Canadian know the situation in Canada, but I bet you that those exemptions are here as well. Now the military has become very well aware of the problem. They see it as a strategic issue, as areas where potential conflict will emerge, new kinds of conflict arising from issues of climate change. And they look at this in the terms of traditional military risk assessment and a notion of security that's based on those ideas, on a military idea. But these things would take an entirely different cast if we looked at the world through the lens of our common security, which is a human-centered, non-violent way forward. We know, for example, that the former Prime Minister Olof Palme of Sweden, he developed the idea of common security, which was actually considered for a long period of time, but really has dropped out. When we talk about common security, we're talking about a whole different way of looking at it, and here's what he said. To promote and fully guarantee respect for human rights, including labor rights, civil and political rights, and social and cultural rights. The right to food, housing, and a universally accessible, not-for-profit healthcare system, right to education and social justice, enable socially equitable and environmentally sound employment, and ensure the right to development as per the UN Convention on this right. To achieve a state of peace, social justice, and disarmament, through reallocation of military expenditure and eradication of poverty, to create a global governance structure that respects the rule of law, and to ensure the preservation and protection of the environment, respecting inherent worth of nature beyond human purpose, and reduce the ecological footprint and move away from the model of development as endless growth, which we know is a model for cancer. Sounds like an unachievable set of objectives. On the other hand, no less is really required for the survival of our species and the creation of a dynamic, positive peace, not the negative peace as envisioned by the military, which is, of course, essentially an armed peace. My particular project is the creation in Canada of a Federal Department of Peace and Nonviolence. It would be a federal level, a cabinet level position, stand alongside the Minister of National Defense, our version of Homeland Security, and so forth. And to hopefully forever change the nature of dialogue and decision-making in Canada towards conflict transformation by peaceful means. This is a project now that is now in its 5th year. It's beginning to gain purchase in Canada. You can read our brochure here if you're interested in that. I just wanted to also mention that what we are trying to do here is not just to work through government, but to empower civil society initiatives in the peace-building field, such as nonviolent communication, alternatives to violence projects, and so forth, which exist and to embed them further in communities where they can take the lead. Because we know at the community level, when our own communities, our neighborhoods, our cities, our regions, can resolve their own issues of conflict in nonviolent, peaceful ways, we empower our communities by doing that. So we don't see the government as taking over. We see it as facilitating, as enabling. And finally, I'd like to mention that this initiative that we have is now in 35 countries around the world. It is a movement that is gaining, as I say, momentum. 3 countries now have ministers of peace. They are, interestingly, 2 of the 3 are countries that have been in a major conflict, protracted conflict over more than a decade. Nepal, in 2007, declared a minister of peace. That minister is also the deputy, what we would call the deputy prime minister. It was agreed to by all the parties and insisted upon by the Maoists, who were the belligerents in that conflict, one of the belligerents. Last year, a country famous for its innovation in peace building since 1948, when it abolished its army, Costa Rica declared a minister of peace. When we were meeting in Costa Rica last September as the Global Alliance for Ministries and Departments of Peace, and he made a stunning speech about the futility and obscenity of war, and that departments of peace, the idea of ministers of peace, is one step along the way. So the final thing I'd like to say, and I find this very, very encouraging, and again in those protracted conflicts in the Sudan, you have many, many parts to this. Darfur is still not, as you know, in any way come to any kind of resolution. But in South Sudan, the capital of which is Juba, they are going to have a referendum next year. There's a provisional government there. It may remain a province, it may become part of the larger state. It's unclear. But that provisional government last month declared a minister of peace there. Another place where we have this kind of conflict that goes on endlessly, and people have just about given up, but then there's these kinds of rays of hope that occur. And I do believe that this, we draw sustenance from ministers of environment. In 1972, there were none. Now every country in the world has a minister of environment. They have positions of centrality now in view of climate change. And so we are heartened by that. And I want to thank you very much for your attention.